Okay, I'm going to turn it over to you, Megan.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. Let's get this going. All right. Is everyone able to, we all good on the screen?
Yep, looks good.
Great, thanks. So like Mark mentioned, my name is Megan Gade. I work for AFO. I've been with AFO for 6 or 7 months and really had the pleasure to meet a lot of state agency folks who are working on these really critical issues. And today I want to sort of give you just an overview and some background on renewable energy and how you might want to think about renewable energy build out in your incorporation into your swaps. So renewable energy is, it's a critical tool in the strategy to decarbonize and mitigate the effects of climate change, right? And with climate change comes a lot of associated biodiversity loss. So it's a really, really important tool to really start to curb our emissions and reduce the effects of climate change. It is necessary. However, like all forms of energy and development broadly, there's negative aspects to renewable energy, especially when it comes to wildlife. So we can think about, things like direct mortality, so bird and bat collisions with wind turbines. When we talk about large-scale solar facilities, they tend to fragment the landscape quite a bit. And just as a quick step back, when we're talking about renewable energy here today with, I think, almost everyone's presentation, we're talking about utility scale solar and wind. So there's obviously other types of renewable energy, nuclear, hydro, but here we're going to be talking about solar and wind at that utility scale. So these are going to be large, multiple megawatt, multiple acres of energy, not necessarily things like rooftop solar. So just keep that in mind that we're always talking about these sort of larger utility scale, but thinking about things like habitat fragmentation and barriers to movement for large solar facilities out west, for example, they can interrupt migration corridors for large ungulates. And we also see things, we see renewable energy have effects on species displacement. So we know that grouse don't really like tall things, right? But then if we put a large wind turbine in the middle of a prairie, now we have a big tall thing that's going to be displacing those animals. So as a state fish and wildlife agency, knowing that we have to have this renewable energy as part of the strategy to curb our emissions, we have to think, how do we achieve that renewable energy build out while minimizing the impacts to wildlife? And this is especially important as we consider the current administration's renewable energy goals and investment. So the Biden administration has set out really ambitious goals. They want 50% of CO2 reduction by 2030 and 100% clean energy grid by 2035 to achieve a net zero economy by 2050. That's a really big goal, right? Like that's super, super lofty. But towards achieving these goals, there's been a historic amount of funding passed just in the last 18 months. So the sort of first big bill that was passed was the IIJA, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, otherwise known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And this was one of the largest direct investments in clean energy infrastructure. There was $62 billion that went to DOE alone for clean energy, grid reliability, workforce improvement, efficiency, and sort of general energy equitability. A second passage, or a second bill passage in August 2022 was the Inflation Reduction Act. In the Inflation Reduction Act, there's $50 billion alone, mostly in the form of tax credit extensions for solar, wind, and other renewables. According to ACP, they recently had a report that came out that said there's already been about $40 billion of clean energy investment since the passage of the IRA. That's a huge amount of investment. So we're already seeing a lot of stuff happening across the landscape in the renewable space to meet these goals. And so, what does this look like on the ground? What is it going to take for us to get that projected build out, get to those net zero goals? So there's one study that I'm going to focus on that recently came out. It's the Princeton Net Zero America study. This was published in October 2021, and it was a really robust modeling study to essentially see what it's going to take for the US to achieve that net zero emission of greenhouse gases by 2050. And they do this by looking at a couple different pathways, et cetera, but I'm just going to sort of focus on what that solar and wind build out needs to look like. So what you're looking at here is a map of sort of the current build out of wind and solar. Wind's in blue and solar, you really can't see a whole lot because there's not a ton on the landscape right now, but that's in orange. So right now, we have about 140 gigawatts installed. When we think about wind turbines, that's, you know, a little bit over, or it is over 65,000 land-based wind turbines across 43 different states. And when we look at this build out by 2050, this is what our renewable energy landscape needs to look like. So we can see that there's a ton of wind build out, especially in those Midwest states where the wind belt exists. And you can see that there's offshore wind as well. And then we see a lot more build out of solar here. So we can see that especially in the southeast and southwestern portions of the United States, which is where those solar resources exist, right? And to note, I think sometimes some people think that offshore wind might be sort of the silver bullet to replace onshore wind and to meet all of our goals. But I think it's really important to note that it's a complement, not necessarily a substitute for onshore wind. So what we can see that by 2050, we have a multiple terawatt expansion that's required. And so let's sort of look at this by the numbers. So for wind alone, we're looking at needing an installation of 250 to 2,000 gigawatts of land-based wind, with 30 to almost 500 gigawatts of offshore. When we sort of looking at an annual basis, we have a necessary annually, we need to be building about 100 gigawatts of renewable energy per year. And that's even more striking and maybe scary to think that historically, we've only had 10 to 15 gigawatts installed each year. And so this can be really, really overwhelming. Perhaps it sounds like it's not going to happen, but all of these modeling efforts that have happened, including, from the Princeton study have suggested that it's possible, with the caveat that there are a couple of limitations and really big hurdles. Some of those include supply chain issues, cost allocations, which is a lot of what the IRA is trying to help with, and siting and permitting. And siting and permitting is sort of the key space where state fish and wildlife agencies play a big role, right? So we have all this, we need all of this land to make sure to do our development. And so it's up to the state fish and wildlife agencies to help be sort of that technical guidance of, okay, we can put these wind turbines here, but not here based off of the resources that we're trying to conserve. Another big issue that I'm not going to dive into, but is transmission. So we have, solar and wind resources that might have to be built in more remote areas, and we need to be able to move that energy to places that need it. So having a large transmission build out is also a really important piece to this puzzle, but we won't dive into that. So let's look at this sort of from the state level. So back to more data from the Princeton study. On the right column, we have sort of our top, what we're seeing here is the top 15 states for solar, which is in yellow on top, and wind, both onshore and offshore, in blue at the bottom. And the first column there is what we have currently in 2020. And then in 2050, what the top sort of 15 states are going to be for both solar and wind build out. So we have, states, California, Texas, Missouri, South Carolina, New Mexico, Iowa, and Nebraska sort of being our top states for wind and solar build out. So let's think about this from sort of a species perspective. When we look at how many, we have about 17,000 species of greatest conservation need nationally. And about 7,500 of those species of greatest conservation need are found within those top states that I just listed. That represents about 44%, almost half of the species of greatest conservation need are found within the states that are going to have the biggest renewable energy build out. That's a really big number, and it underscores the importance of all states, especially these big build-out states, of thinking about how we can conserve those species in the face of renewable energy development. So towards, this effort of trying to help state fish and wildlife agencies, AFWA put out a survey in 2019 to state fish and wildlife agencies to understand what their concerns, what their needs, and what their interests are related to wind energy siting. And we were able to identify a number of different threats that agencies see with wildlife. So the first threat to wildlife is direct impact. So collisions, birds, bats, both raptor and non-raptor, and grouse potentially having direct impacts from wind turbines. We also see indirect impacts, so things like habitat loss is a really big concern for mammals, non-raptor birds, and grouse. And then cumulative effects, so things like population level effects, and state fish and wildlife agencies are concerned about that for sort of the same birds, bats, raptors, and non-raptors. We also more recently developed and sent out a solar survey. So sort of the same idea, but now we want to talk about solar and see sort of what are the needs, what's going on the solar side. A lot of the same threats were identified, but there were some new threats that were identified through this survey, including habitat fragmentation, movement barriers, species displacement, and invasive species introductions. And the really sort of big thing to remember here with the solar survey was that the responses were super regionally specific. So we have really different concerns in the southwestern part of the United States than what we see in the northeastern part of the United States. We have different habitats, we have different threats. To that end, sort of at a national scale, agencies identified grassland prairie, shrubland steppe, agriculture and grazing lands as being the habitats at greatest risks, and migrating ungulates, waterfowl, small mammals, reptiles, and amphibians as being the greatest species at risk. So we saw with wind, we're really concerned about birds and bats and more and different species at risk for the solar side. It's also really important to note that we have a lot less information about solar. We're about 20 years behind in terms of our knowledge base from wind with solar. Solar is ramping up really quickly, in much more rapidly than wind ever did. So really trying to get information, get research, figure out what those research and needs are from state fish and wildlife agencies is a really big priority for AFWA right now. So what can states do when it comes to regulatory mechanisms? I'll first talk about what happens at the federal level. There's a document called the Wind Energy Guidelines. It was developed in 2012, and it essentially promotes compliance with relevant wildlife laws and regulation, and it encourages both pre and post construction surveys and monitoring, and it emphasizes avoidance, minimization, and compensation when it comes to wildlife. They've been effective, but with the big caveat being they're still voluntary. There is no federal statute that's requiring developers to think about these sorts of things. And at the state level, every state is different, right? So there's various regulatory and non-regulatory mechanisms that states are dealing with, or to deal with development. And so it's really on the State Fish and Wildlife Agency a lot of times to rely on voluntary approaches, rely on guidances that they write that they can sort of hopefully get in the hands of developers. And what we're really trying to promote is that, that the agency and industry really work together so that the agency can provide technical guidance to developers and other regulatory bodies when it comes to citing these renewable energy projects. And so if we can think about this and really start to incorporate these threats and potential mitigation for these threats in your SWAP guidance, that could be a really great resource for both you so that you know what's happening as we start seeing this development ramp up, but also to sort of pass along to developers or anyone else who might be thinking about citing something in a habitat that you are charged with conserving. So today, Mark already gave them a great introduction, but today we want to present you with two resources that are available to try to help you guys think about incorporating renewable energy into your swap. So I think with that, I'll turn it over to Ryan, and he can talk from the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute. Sorry, I'm trying to do three things at once.
Great, thanks, Megan. Just give me a thumbs up when you can see my screen. All right, thanks. Yes, I'm Ryan Butrin, and I'm with the Renewable Energy Wildlife Institute. We call it REWI. And my role is an information science manager. I work on getting data available for research. So REWI supports research into wildlife and renewable energy issues. And I just wanted to start out by pointing you all to our website as a resource. So before I get going into today's primary topic, I just wanted to make sure you all know about rewi.org. And I was just going to help drive you around here a little bit so you know how to find information. And if you're not familiar with wind and wildlife issues, you're going to want to start here with the Wind and Wildlife Guide. This is a really comprehensive, graphically appealing step through all kinds of issues around wind and wildlife. We don't have one for solar yet. We're planning to do that, but this will give you the groundwork and all the citations for getting up to speed really quickly. Another piece of information that you'd want to know how to find is our results catalog. The results catalog has all of the products that REWI produces, whether it's a journal publication or something that we publish ourselves. A great example of a resource that might be valuable is our summary of wind power interactions with wildlife. So this is a document that's updated annually. So it's a great place to get the most up-to-date science on wind and wildlife impacts. And you can go here and download it and access it. Also, we have a research hub, which is a new product this past year. This is a place where you can go and find a large collection of research products related to solar and wind. And this is going to be constantly updated. And if you know of a resource that you don't see on there, there's the ability for you to add it. So that's a tool that we have. And one other thing, when it comes into more specific, you're looking for impacts to a particular species in your region. My program's called the American Wind Wildlife Information Center, is a effort to combine everything we know about collisions at wind energy facilities. So we publish technical reports, one on birds and one on bats, and those come out anytime we have more data to add. And these are data that are not available publicly. They're shared with us through confidentiality agreements, and we make these reports. And this is a great place to go for what's been reported about particular species impacts in your region. So that's putting the data behind a lot of this other information that we have here. So I just wanted to take that moment to familiarize you with our website and make sure you know that it's a place that you can go and find those types of information. And please, reach out to anyone at REWI through our contact on here, and we can point you to what you need. All right, so I'm going to spend the rest of my time here. I'm going to stop sharing this and put up a demo of a new tool that is not available on our website. It's not available to anybody except me currently. And I want to figure out if it's helpful to you and something that you can use. So a little background, we had a postdoc working with us who was taking a big picture approach to risk to cumulative impacts to wildlife in North America. Part of that was an assessment of what are the species of greatest conservation need that are really there's a lot of concern around and are sort of popular targets for talking about renewable energy and wildlife. And so the postdoc went through all of the swaps, all 50 swaps, and pulled out information about threats to specific species and then did a summary. They also did a interview with a lot of state agencies. It's possible some of you on the call had talked to the postdoc, and so that went into a report. And I was in a meeting, where they were talking about it, and I was like, you know what, there's some useful data here that might be good to pull together from the swaps about threats. So I worked with some other colleagues, and we had an intern program set up that we had an intern from William & Mary University come in, and they did a bang up job going through all of the swaps. And their method is pretty basic. It was searched the entire swap for the words wind, solar, and renewable. And every mention of those words in each swap that was associated with a species was extracted as a threat. So this created a table of well over 1,000 mentions of species and renewable energy. And we added a few attributes to those specific threats. For example, just a higher level taxa, is it a bird, bat, herps, other mammals, some of the perceived threats that Megan was talking about, such as habitat loss or collision. And we had the intern use this program called Power BI to create a dashboard so we could explore the data. This has been done for about a year, and we're busy with all kinds of different things and just looking for the right opportunity to start sort of shopping around and getting some feedback on this, and started talking to Megan about it. And we were, she was excited on what she saw and thought it'd be a great opportunity to share with you all, and just let us know if this is something that we can make further investment in to make it available to you on our website, so it's something that you could access as you're rewriting your swaps. So it's a little bit of the background on the effort. I'm just going to kind of step through a demo of what we have here. So, and this is running just on the back end of the app. So you see a lot of extra things that wouldn't be there in a final version. But we have a map, and the darkness of the colors indicates how many species threats were identified in that state. So our winner here is Massachusetts with 134 species mentioned, and then the lighter colors are fewer. And down below here is a table where you can see what was extracted. So we copied the exact text out of the swap as a threat description here. So if I select a state, I'll pick Colorado. Colorado has 96 species threats. I can see on the taxa here that there's birds, bats, other mammals, invertebrates, and herps mentioned, mostly surrounding habitat loss or degradation, collision on a few, and habitat fragmentation on 17. And then in the table, we have all of the species name, their scientific name, and their threats, verbatim copied out of out of the swap. And one of the, I'll just continue with the demo and then talk about applications. So we can also toggle on different types of renewable energy. So for solar, I just clicked on solar. We can see the states that have made some mention of solar energy and wildlife. And same for wind. Looks here like all states except for Missouri had a mention of a wind renewable types. So this is definitely something you've all been thinking of and have in your plans. And you know, but there may be some lessons you could learn from what other states are doing and mentioning if they house similar species or have similar species of concern. And so we can toggle on renewable energy types. I showed you how you could look at states. We can also filter by taxa. Birds are popular. There's over 600, 607 specific species threats for birds. Second is bats at 153. So if you're interested in mammals, we can click on the mammals and see the states where there's a mention of a mammal and review the threats as they appeared in the swaps in the table below. So that's another angle that you can query this collection of species threats. Just clearing that, it's got all renewable selected, and then if you're wanting to look at different types of threats, such as habitat loss, you can click here, see the states that mentioned that particular threat, and then all of the associated species. So it's a kind of a starting point for being able to explore the perceived threats as mentioned in swaps. One of the ways that I think about this, I mentioned those technical reports that we have. When I'm looking to update those, I can I want those reports to be valuable to you and other stakeholders. So understanding what species are mentioned and where collisions are listed as a concern, I can help tailor future editions of that technical report to issues that are relevant to all of you. I'll show one more. As I've showed a few people this, and a question came up: what about specific species? Can I look up? So I did do a species-specific view. If you wanted to have a species in mind that you want to look up, in this case, say a little brown myotis is a species that is threatened for a number of reasons, mainly white nose, but also can appear as collisions, and just using this slicer here to get a sense of what are the states and mechanisms and specific threats that have been mentioned. And I'll just make a few comments about the types of threats. Sometimes they're pretty general. Like, for example, birds have been observed as collisions at wind turbines. Sometimes they're hyper-specific about a particular behavior of a species. For example, something like horned lark, which is a bird in open areas that has a mating display that could put it at a greater risk of turbine collisions. So there's a range of what those threats are, and some states may have different mentions in their swaps of the same species, but maybe at different levels of detail. And so we've done our best to be as comprehensive as possible, just sticking to the sort of objective process of searching for solar and wind and renewable in the swap and identifying any of the threats associated with it. So those are the highlights. I'd love to spend the rest of my time here chatting about, with you, getting some feedback on what you think. You can ask a question. We can, filter the data to be relevant to your question. I really like to kind of be able to go off from this call with a sense of, how much investment REWI can put into making this tool available to you. If there's substantial overhaul that needs to be done, or if it's good enough as it is, we can just host it so you can access it. Getting a sense of what the value would be to you all. This is something that we did for our internal use and understanding, and we just think there could be an opportunity here to bring this to more folks. So, Megan, I don't know if you want to kind of talk us through a question and answer.
Yeah, sure. Mark, maybe now's the time to put those polls out, and that can sort of guide the discussion. Mark, you are muted.
All right, you want to maybe hit a couple of the questions that are in the chat first?
Oh, great.
Here, so actually I've got those. I can ask a few. So Ryan, you do have a couple of questions here.
Okay.
The first is, out of curiosity, how much change has there been in the installation of renewable energy in the US since 2015? Is it possible that either the number of states that identify threats arising from renewable energy or the magnitude of concern has changed since the last swaps were written?
Yeah, there's been considerable build out. I don't have all the numbers in front of me now, but yeah, there's going to be more wind, and there could be other species of concern that maybe people are thinking about more now that they haven't been thought about in the past. So I think it's something that deserves taking a fresh look at in preparing these swaps.
And Megan, did you have any thoughts on that one as well?
I think Ryan covered it. Yeah, there has been considerable build out since you first wrote, in 2015, those swaps. There's only not every state is going to have wind development because they don't always have, the wind resources that are available. So there's some states that it's not going to change. But certainly as we get sort of more stuff on the ground, the threats are certainly going to change. So that's why I think sort of having these resources and seeing what states have made, what recommendations they've made in the past will be really helpful for incorporating that into future things, and having the resources that REWI has with their state of the science and being able to incorporate those is a great tool.
Thank you. So I'll ask the next one. I wonder if it would be interesting to take the data in your bird and bat research summary reports and present them in this dashboard. Instead of basing it on the swap threats, base it on the research synthesis you've done. Which species are showing the greatest impacts, where, etc.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, honestly, that was my first instinct, was to compare what the actual numbers are in our collision database and how they compare to the threats that were listed in the swaps. So I guess some follow up on that. Would it be valuable to have both pieces of information, the actual collision data alongside of the swap data, or were those two separate things?
So it showed up in as one question, but you could divide it if you want.
Which question is it in the chat?
I
It
was, I think it was the third one. I can put it back in
Oh, yeah.
again if you, okay.
I see it now. Yeah, so that is, I do want to do a follow-up. It's something for our collision data. We're working with our data contributors on, so I have developed a dashboard for that collision data. Right now, it's only accessible to our contributors. Rewise committed to making that more widely available, and I'm hoping, in the timeline that you're working on this swap updates, that's going to be something that is open for state agencies to access. That's a goal of mine with my program to make those data available. There's a lot of players involved in making that happen and doing it the right way. But yes, completely on board with having that be a dashboard as well.
So I think that actually gets at the next question, which was, could you provide the exact URL for this interactive map at Rewind? And I think what I heard you say is that it's right now it's internal, but that you're looking to make it accessible.
Yeah, this is completely internal. There is not a URL available for it. Kind of using the feedback from this call to decide if that's something we want to make available.
And then the last one, I think I've got, actually, I'm actually two more came in. Could you please provide some background on why you have titled this as perceived threats? States have identified these as actual threats to habitat and species based on extensive data and knowledge of energy development in their state. So adding a qualifier such as perceived could undermine the reporting included in the swaps.
Yeah, that was based on some feedback we received about earlier versions of this dashboard. And I believe the thinking there is that we didn't want to, so you understand what the swap is saying and doing as the states and the authors. But if there's another user of this tool that was using it to completely identify threats, specific threats to species and renewable energy, there could be a sort of lost in translation happening there. So we want to try to be as specific as possible. I will add, there are some threats that are mentioned that are not in line with the current science on particular topics. So there is there is room in the swaps to review the current science and on some particular topics and species and make sure that the swaps are reflecting the best possible knowledge.
Got it. All right, and we are well ahead of time here, so you've got plenty of time for other questions here. I'm just looking at the other comments. So let me just see here. I think this is one from Virginia. It's more of a comment. I think the ability to easily see what other states have said for threats to individual SGCNs would be great. Sounds like conservation actions relevant to addressing threats were not pulled out. Conservation actions would be very useful, but likely also harder to tie to individual species. So Virginia, I'm just going to double check. Did you have a question associated with that or anything else you wanted to add?
Hey, Mark. No, I guess sort of buried in that is a question about the feasibility of pulling out conservation actions, based on the approach that was taken. I realize that probably isn't possible with what has already been done. And depending on the different states, like for New Mexico, we didn't tie our actions to specific species. So that information simply doesn't exist in our swap. You kind of have to tie it through a chain of other information. And, you know, I realize different states did different things. So I'm not sure the extent to which it would really be possible across states to tie actions to species. But in terms of what I would be looking at, it would primarily be pulling actions that we don't already have in our swap from other states. That would kind of be my probably most useful application for this sort of assessment of swaps across states.
Thanks, Jenny. Ryan, do you have any thoughts?
Well, yeah, I think Virginia answered the hard part with that. And I was not the one to go through all 50 swaps. So I don't have that level of familiarity with what's included and not. But yeah, having it would be a very large effort to sort of link actions to these threats without having an intimate knowledge of each swap. So that would be almost something that you all would have to kind of feed in to a dashboard like this, which, you know, happy to facilitate, but I don't know if there's appetite across the board for that.
Got it. Okay. We do have a few others, and Karina, I do see your question. Just keeping the focus on this one for right now, but I do flag it. So you had a comment, Ryan, you could lay the actual data into this, or if it could be done separately, I think either would be fine. One of the issues with using research data in the dashboard is that often these swap species are rare species, which have limited reports or research on impacts. Rare events such as collisions are even more rare for species present in low numbers. And habitat impacts are not necessarily included in the report cited or included in summary. So both are likely of use. And we're going to hold, that'll be the last one for right now so that we could do the survey if you want to do it.
Okay, yeah, I think it'd be great to be able to get some objective feedback with using the survey.
Okay. So I didn't know if you had any comments on the one I just said, but we could, I think, Mark, if you want to launch a survey, we'll do that with the next couple of minutes.
Okay, it's launched.
Oh, it is. Okay, great. See, this is the problem with 3 screens. I don't see it. All right. So you all should see on your screen 5 different questions. Take a few minutes to take a look and answer them, and we'll take a look at the results. Okay. What we'll do is we'll talk about these. We have another about 13 minutes here. Then we'll hear from TNC, and then we'll have some time for additional questions and discussion. So keep putting them into the note, and I promise we're going to start with Karina's first.
Kelly, I think you're right. The first 2 questions look like they're the same. And to flag for you guys, if you're answering yes, we'd really appreciate any sort of feedback in the chat as to why or what changes you might want to see.
Seeing just under half of you have replied so far. And I am capturing your comments from everyone as I see it onto the notes from the meeting, so we'll have those captured too. Okay, got about half of you there, so keep the comments coming.
I'll just add a comment in, if that's all right, about from Karen's mention of the rare species. And certainly the top collisions that we see in our, especially for birds in our collision data are very common species. Your like pigeons, mourning doves, hornlark are usually some of the top species in most regions. When it comes to the rare species, it's there's hundreds, and I think 100, forgetting all the numbers, but more than half of the species occur 3 times or less in over 500,000 searches. So the data are heavily skewed where rare species are just not found and reported, so it's not incredibly useful for assessing the overall risk to those species. It's kind of something that I'm trying to use the data more from looking at the effort that was put in to doing the searching. So if you have a lot of effort in a particular area where you know a rare species is to exist, I mean, that's information that's valuable for understanding what the possible risk might be. I think zeros have information. The data are not generally reported to us as zeros and ones, but I've been kind of reworking the data that we have to better understand the effort in relationship to what was found, both in terms of the quantity of collisions, but also the diversity in species. So are we learning more information with more searches? So when you're thinking about rare species, that's a valuable angle to think about, because and what we generally see is that after about 10,000 searches, you've gotten about 80% of the species, and then it goes a very small return on investment after that point with learning about new species that could be showing up as collisions with each additional search. So there's the point there, we've done how to know we did enough searching to know we didn't find something. That's going to certainly vary by region, but it's kind of a tipping point there. How much more investment is needed to be certain that something's not going to happen if it hasn't happened the first 400,000 times that we looked. So
right. Okay, well, I think we've had it open long enough. Megan or Mark, I can talk through the results, or if you want to walk through them.
Okay, should I end the poll? Is there anybody out there that needs a little more time? Okay, I'm going to end the poll. So can you see that, Jason, to share?
Oh, here we go. Share results. So I've never done a poll in Zoom, so I don't know. I'm hoping people can see this.
Mhm.
So the first one, well, the first two, since they're basically the same question. Would you find value in having the reswap tool as accessible to your agency? Ryan, I think it's pretty overwhelming that people are interested. You got 25 responses saying yes and one saying no.
That's great. Yeah, got some work ahead of me.
So the next one, besides the swap revisions, I'm sorry, would the tool be useful for your swap revisions? If yes, put a comment in the chat. That's actually a little different than what I had in my notes, sorry. And there, again, pretty overwhelming that there was support here, with 21 out of 26 people saying yes, and 5 saying no. And we have a slew of comments here, so I've captured all of that in the chat for the meeting, so we'll go through that. But I think maybe what I'll ask is real quick, if does anyone have something that you want to speak to from one of the comments that you put in? Well, like I said, I do have it captured, Ryan, and I'll make sure I share it with you and everyone else after the meeting, so you'll have it.
Great.
Next is, besides swap revisions, are there other ways you or your agency could use the swap tool? If yes, put a comment in the chat. So what you're seeing actually is 73% of respondents said yes, and only 7 or 27% said no. So again, there, I think you're seeing that there is some, and like I said, I haven't read all the comments in exhaustive detail yet, but we'll have those. And then this last one was split 50-50. Are there changes or improvements to the tool that you could recommend? And I think there you've already started hearing from people as to what they would like to see. So with that, does anyone have any last questions here? We can also come back to it, but otherwise we'll jump over to the Nature Conservancy. Okay. Well, Ryan, thanks for your time. Megan, do you want to introduce TNC?
Absolutely, Ryan, thanks so much. And so now we're so excited to have Nathan Cummings and Chris Hayes from the Nature Conservancy talk about a tool that they've developed called Site Renewables Right. And this actually might help get us some of the questions that we've talked about. It'll be a really great tool, and we're so excited to have you guys. So please, Nathan, take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Megan, for having us. And I will say, you know, our presentation might get cut in half because you and Ryan did such a great job teeing up the issue that I think our usual first 5 or 6 slides may look a little repetitive to folks here. But, you know, from the Nature Conservancy's perspective, we always want to frame kind of what we're working on and why we're working on it. You know, this tool has been out for some time now. So we are here to give you all sort of an update of the latest and greatest in terms of where it's at, where we'd like to see it go. This tool does cover, you know, a lot of the states on the call, but it doesn't cover all the states. So, you know, hopefully this isn't too regionally specific and everyone finds value. So with that, I'm going to start here, but I'm going to share my screen. So give me 1 second to get our slides going. Is everyone seeing that? Does that work? Okay, great.
Yes.
Thanks so much. So as Megan said, so my name is Nathan. I've been at TNC for just about 10 years. I'm a director of our renewable energy programs in our Great Plains division. So that's a lot of our central United States. I also have a dual role. I work for our global tackle climate change team, leading all of our market-based approaches to accelerating renewable energy. And I think it's good to kind of start at what our key mission statement is. And even before that, I realized I didn't introduce Chris. Chris is going to be joining me. Chris is the technical lead of our Site Renewables Right project and has been involved in this work for a long time. And he'll introduce himself when it gets to him to talk through the actual data and what we provide. But broadly, TNC, we want and need to see more renewables on the landscape, but we want to do so in a way that is both clean, green, and equitable in how we think about this. So at a high level, and I'll get into this a little bit later, but we're thinking about what are the actual biodiversity impacts for renewables hitting the landscape? How can those be avoided to the maximum extent possible? And if not, then how can we drive down the mitigation hierarchy in an effective way to ensure that we're meeting both the climate and biodiversity crises that we are working on here? And then how do we make sure that we learn from energy transitions of the past to ensure that, these burdens are not being unfairly put on frontline communities, but also recognizing that the burdens have already been put on frontline communities. So by decarbonizing the energy system, we are helping to alleviate those as well. And so we want to make sure that in all of our work, that is centered as well. And that's something that we still have a lot of work to do as an organization and our state chapters. But I've been pretty excited just in the past few years how we've been prioritizing that more. So Megan did a great job explaining all of this, so I won't spend too much more time on it, but it's more just a +1 to everything that was said earlier. We have to massively increase the renewable energy build out. We need to be breaking records every year for the next 10 years just to stay on track. And these projects require a lot of land. This is not new to anyone here, and they're driving huge land use change. For example, since about 2016, solar's been the #1 driver of loss of forest in Virginia. And that's not because the solar industry is going out there trying to cut down trees. It's just the way the economics work, the way the siting works. And so we're trying to think about what is a collective strategy that can really bend those development trends. And we think that's really important. I mean, not only to protect the habitats and landscapes that we're all waking up and working on, but to actually accelerate the transition, because we're seeing more and more of these projects get mired in conflict that can really pause or delay the renewable energy transition. One stat that's interesting, there's I think roughly 300 counties in the United States that have developed some sort of either formal or informal ban for renewable energy through moratorium. Some of those are just pauses while they get the rules right. Others are more complete. We're not interested in this type of development. We've seen those increase 20% just in the past year or two. So that's obviously a trend we can't continue as a country. And so we got to find ways to be a little more integrated in this approach so we can meet our net zero future and goals for the decarbonization and also biodiversity. So when we think about this just very broadly, we kind of tagline the phrase go smart to go fast. And we're thinking about both what are the climate opportunities for this transition, both how do you make sure renewables are always going to be good for climate, but how can you make sure those carbon impacts are optimized, both in terms of where they go on the landscape to the grid. That gets to that point I said very earlier of we want to make sure we decarbonize the areas that have faced the burdens of fossil fuel most efficiently for, if anything else, public health, but obviously for broadly environmental reasons too. For conservation, we think, we have to find a way to protect wildlife and habitat and not have this be an either or conversation. There's no way we're going to meet our collective goals if we do that. And then lastly, on the community side, to build on that again, making sure we support an equitable energy transition. So while we are focused on those large scale projects, like Megan outlined at the beginning, they're obviously not the only projects that drive impact. And the more projects we can get on rooftops, the more projects we can get into communities that are historically disadvantaged, I think the better, assuming that those are aligned to community interests, and then we can really make sure that we accelerate those development trends. We're going to focus, Chris and I are going to focus on some of our siting and science work because I think that's most applicable to this group, but we'd be happy to talk offline or even with any of our state chapters that are in the states that you all represent on some of these other strategies, if you all would be interested. So with that, I'm just going to give a brief background on some of the science here in the space, and then I'm going to transition to my colleague, Chris, who's going to jump in and actually run through kind of some of the data and what our analysis shows. What we're really showing here on this slide is, we've been doing a lot of science in this space. We're certainly not the only organization. Rui has been doing some great work too. A lot of folks around the phone here have been doing some great work. And so we're trying to elevate that work. And so we really see Site Renewables Right as a platform to do that. It kind of takes the latest and greatest science as we understand it to date and visually displays it to the maximum extent possible and tries to get the data into the hands of the folks that are actually making the decisions. So whether that is renewable energy developers, whether it is power purchasers, whether it is planning agencies, just making sure it's all out there. And so then we can start thinking about how do we effectively drive change? Some of that's going to be through policy, through IRA, things like that. Others going to be through market-based interventions. Other times it's going to be at the local and county and state level. And so that's kind of an all of the above, but we want to make sure everything we're doing is grounded in science. And so that's really how we've approached our Site Renewables Right effort to date. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. So Chris, if you could just kind of come on, introduce yourself, maybe provide a little background as to how we first collected this data, and then we can drive through some of the maps and results. I'll come back on, talk a little bit about how we're applying it and how we're seeing some opportunities we think for influence, and then open it up for discussion and questions.
All right, thanks, Nathan. So yeah, I'm Chris Heiss. I work for the Oklahoma chapter of the Nature Conservancy. I've been with TNC for about 22 years now. I manage our Four Canyon Preserve out in the western part of the state. It probably doesn't mean a lot to most of you, but it's the place I call home. And I've worked off and on renewable energy siting issues for many years now, dating back to the early 2000s when wind development really first began to expand here in Oklahoma. And I've been grateful to be involved with the Site Renewables Right project for several years. This started with some work we originally did in Kansas and Oklahoma, and it then expanded to other parts of the Great Plains. And now we're working in a 19-state region of the central US. So next slide, Nathan. Yeah, and this is the area we have selected for our analysis. Again, it encompasses a 19-state region that captures about 80% of the country's installed or planned wind capacity. And I believe as of today, that includes five of the top 5 states for installed wind capacity in the US and 9 of the top 10. So the top 5 being Texas, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Illinois, I believe. Next slide, Nathan. So our Site Renewables Right analysis incorporates 2 sets of factors. The first of these we call our key wildlife areas map. This represents rare species distributions, sensitive habitats where improperly sited wind development could pose known threats to certain wildlife populations. So there are well over 100 different data layers that went into the creation of this map. Obviously don't have time to cover all those in detail today. If you're interested in that information, we'll provide a link at the end of our talk to our website where you can access a 40+ page methods paper that outlines all of our sources, assumptions, great bedtime reading if you're into that sort of thing. But key wildlife areas in this geography include things like migratory stopover sites for the federally endangered whooping crane, high density nesting areas for eagles and other raptors, priority habitats for the 7 species of grouse that occur in the study area, sites that are important to breeding waterfowl in the prairie pothole region of the northern Great Plains, important bird areas in the upper Midwest as designated by the National Audubon Society and other organizations, important bat roosts. Where data were available, we identified the locations of these and then buffered them based on foraging distance and other aspects of species biology. We mapped critical and other occupied, threatened, and endangered species habitats, crucial wintering range and migration corridors for big game animals in the Rocky Mountain states, important wetlands and riparian corridors, protected and managed lands. So this is parks, refuges, nature conservancy preserves, privately owned conservation easements, places where we've made significant private and public investments in conservation. Intact natural habitats. So in this part of the country, a majority of the landscape has been altered by development, mostly conversion to agriculture. And that makes the protection of these few remaining areas of relatively intact grassland and forest a high priority for the Nature Conservancy. We've mapped other areas of biodiversity significance, highlighted in previous assessments by the Nature Conservancy and partners. And lastly, we map the locations of climate resilient lands, places where physical attributes likely lend some resilience to the landscape to the effects of climate change in the future. And again, this is our primary map product. We've elected to make a simplified version of this data set available for download so that interested parties can access it, incorporate it into their own GIS, and use it for decision making. Whoops, I think you skipped one there, Nathan.
Sorry.
That's all right. Keeping me on my toes here. So yeah, I think there's a, well, maybe we did, maybe that one didn't get included. We also mapped the locations of areas that where there may be engineering or land use constraints for wind energy development. This is not our primary concern. You know, we're biologists and not engineers, but folks in the industry are very quick to point out that they face many barriers to project siting. And so we felt it was important to account for those things, at least in some general way, to ensure that our results were realistic. If we ask people to, you know, work to avoid wildlife habitats and there's nowhere else for them to work, then we don't have a viable strategy. So we mapped a number of these engineering and land use constraints, largely following previous publications from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory and other organizations. And once we have these two sets of factors, we did some very simple raster GIS. So start with the entire study area, subtract the places that have engineering constraints, and then subtract the mapped wildlife conflicts. Places that are left over, in theory anyway, should be well suited to wind development. And that's what you see represented on this map here. And if we do the math on this, the figures are really quite positive. Based on a nameplate capacity density of 3 megawatts per square kilometer, which is an average for all installed wind facilities in the US, likely on the conservative side, it looks like we've got the potential to install an additional, 935 or so gigawatts of wind capacity. And that's just within these 19 states and just within these mapped green low impact areas. 935 gigawatts is a lot of electricity. That's almost equivalent to, well, no, that's about 10 times the amount of wind that's installed in the entire United States today. Now, this map is largely conceptual. We don't suggest that you could go out and install all of this wind tomorrow. We'd have to build a lot of new transmission in order to get this power to market. There will be unmapped constraints that folks have to deal with. And there may be landowners that don't want wind development on their property. But what this suggests is that there's plenty of room to go big on wind. Not only can we meet our existing ambitious renewable energy goals, we think we can go well beyond that and really start to explore deep decarbonization scenarios. And if we're smart about where we site the facilities, we think we can do that without having major negative impacts on wildlife. Next slide. Yeah, and so we've also developed a subset of, we've developed a secondary key wildlife areas map. It's based on a subset of the layers we included for wind that can be used in a similar way with solar facilities. As others have said today, solar is rapidly growing across the US, including in this region. So yeah, it is important to point out when you get cool results like this that there's a lot we don't know. We've tried to utilize the best information that was out there to populate our models. Some of that is peer-reviewed and in the public domain. Some of it is not. So we're going to work to continue to improve our data and assumptions as time goes on. Wherever you build wind turbines, they're going to kill some birds and bats. That's just an unfortunate reality of the situation. And again, there's a lot we don't know, but hopefully we'll be able to avoid the worst impacts by siting in these known low impact areas. Some of the impacts are poorly understood. There is a significant issue with mortality of migratory tree bats. We don't have a great siting answer to that issue right now. So at least in the short term, we're going to have to rely on other aspects of the mitigation hierarchy, curtailment and mitigation to kind of get around that challenge. But, as Nathan said, this really represents an effort to do the best with what we have, get this information out into the hands of people that can make these decisions and work to improve our data over time. And I think that's it for my bit of the presentation. Nathan?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And I just want to maybe spend one point, and let's go back here just a second because it'll come up, I think. So on this solar map, one of the things is we do not have a corresponding quote unquote low impact analysis. And that's not because there is an opportunity there, but we actually didn't find it very helpful when we did the analysis. I mean, it kind of shows that the entire state of Illinois could be full of solar facilities, just because we have less environmental constraints due to less available knowledge. And this is more just a map of where we would suggest any type of development to be avoided. And obviously with solar and with wind, there are ways. Two same projects could have two total different impacts on the landscape depending on the type of minimization technologies that are built in, et cetera. So, our statement on wind, we think holds very true on the solar side as well, but we didn't want to kind of go out there publicly on it just because we didn't find it very helpful for actual decision making, which we could happily chat more. Folks are interested. The other thing that often comes up is kind of why these states. We first chose these because, as what Chris said, that's where the wind was. And then in classic nonprofit fashion, we continued to choose these for solar because it's where we had the data, and we could get it out there as soon as possible. We do have a goal of expanding this across the US, which I'll talk about here in a second. But just a couple kind of key points, because this is how we always talk about it. We want to make sure folks understand this is a source of information for early screening and to inform state and federal and state renewable energy guidelines. This is not a replacement for it. Just because a developer goes in and looks at our map doesn't mean that they have consulted with the appropriate wildlife agencies, obviously, or even just wildlife groups. It's not intended to replace any guidelines, but we do think this is a complementary approach and maybe a visual representation if TNC was going through the WEGs, what we would be looking at and why. Not a go, no-go zone map, as I said before. There's probably areas we don't have mapped that are critically important, and there's probably areas within our map that, depending on the different ways the mitigation hierarchy is applied by the developer, there's certainly opportunities for renewable energy build out, but it is obviously consistent with what we're all trying to do here, promote avoidance to the maximum extent possible. And we do think, all else equal, projects that are built inside areas where we think there could be known impacts should receive greater scrutiny and review. And we continue to welcome input on both the data and science to inform these future maps. We run a lot of that through our state chapters, but we would want to make sure that obviously everyone on this call feels like they've had consultation on this. As I said, we're going to be hoping to update through an expansion, and that provides us an opportunity to also look at the data to make sure that it's still to the best available science. So if you all think that there's a key thing that's missing and there's a science paper about that, please let us know, because we find that really helpful. And I'll just share real quickly some of the uptake we've had and then go to questions. We've gotten some nice recognition. So in 2021, when we released our solar version and our wind version, we got a nice award by the Renewables Grid Initiative, which is a European-based consortium of industry and environmental nonprofits looking to seek and expand renewable energy. And of course, from the friends on this call today, this is back in, I believe, 2018, 2019 for the Climate Adaptation Leadership Award that was received at the AFWA conference that was up here in Minneapolis. So, these are just some testaments to the fact that folks I think are finding this data useful and getting more data out there. We've also been trying to really make sure it's being used. So kind of the biggest way we've been doing that to date is working through markets, and particularly clean energy buyers. Clean energy buyers have represented about 40% of all large-scale renewable energy projects built in the US since 2014. They have a huge demand, but they also have huge opportunities because they can control, where they buy energy from, and to a greater degree than you or I could, or even that federal or state governments could. So we've really been trying to advance these principles in procurement practices. So when the companies are looking across their projects, they can either pick the ones that they want to support, for example, projects built on formerly degraded lands like mine lands, brownfields, et cetera, or be sure to avoid the projects that don't align to their values, such as projects that are sited in biodiversity areas. So we have some case studies that have been built out more on this. This is one of them. We're hopeful to have another one come out early this spring that's focused more on a corporate buyer's perspective with an individual company of how they apply these principles. And we're also working with renewable energy developers, especially developers that have adopted net positive biodiversity commitments. Most of those are European-based developers currently, to make sure we figure out how those are durable and how those are science-based in terms of their application. And yeah, I think we have a nice little video on our website I recommend folks look at and the methods paper that Chris talked about. So with that, we'd be happy to answer questions folks have about this map or just more broadly about some of the strategies TNC is working on. So thanks for having us.
All right. Hey, thanks so much. Appreciate it. So we do have some time for questions, and I promised Karina, plus I also got like 3 or 4 requests from other people about it. Karina, do you want to come online? So you had asked this question from Megan, but it sounds like it might be relevant for everyone. I don't know if you had anything to add related to the other 2 talks. How is the impact of geographic placement of renewable energy infrastructure on frontline communities being incorporated into siting recommendations and prioritization? Did you have anything else on that one, Karina?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Jason, and thanks to all for your presentations. I bring this up because I've been hearing a lot. I'm someone from an urban environment, and so my, personal experience as a frontline community member is different than, say, someone in a rural area. And so I've been hearing a lot more from folks who live in rural areas about their concerns with wind energy, and kind of going beyond a like not in my backyard situation, but like rural communities who already have, kind of less access to a lot of the amenities that these renewable energy efforts are going to create, right? Like we'll be bearing that brunt. And so are there, I don't know, there are a lot of data layers in the tool that you just shared, and of course there are other kind of mechanisms by which people are choosing geographically where they place renewable energy infrastructure, but how is essentially community impact for communities that are either already bearing, the greatest brunt of the way that we currently produce energy, or who already do not have as much access to, like the resources that folks who are benefiting the most from our current energy usage currently have. So rural communities, urban communities, Black and brown communities, how are the impacts on those communities weighing, where we choose to put turbines and solar panels?
Well, I'm happy to take a cut from TNC's perspective, if that would be helpful, and then kick to others. I mean, I think what, again, plus one, everything you just said, I think it's critically important, and we have to integrate these concerns. There's no kind of in-between option. I think how we've been considering it is making sure we use our platform as a way to elevate, but also not overstep where we are not experts in this space. So, for example, with site renewables, right? Currently, we don't have sort of community-based data in there. It's not because we don't want it, but it's because we didn't want to kind of come out and be the organization that says go here, not here, for areas that we don't have expertise on. But we are in the next version hoping to bring that type of data in. One data set we've been considering kind of most closely is the White House climate and equity data set run through CEQ that you can screen for multiple types of energy and environmental factors that could impact historically disadvantaged communities. If you haven't checked that one out, that's a good one. It's publicly available. So when we talk about like corporate guidance, we ask developers to respond in terms of, is a project being cited in one of these areas? And then if it is, to also ensure that the community supports it. We also don't want to like incent projects driving into these areas if the community would rather say get unit housing and economic development on that brownfield instead. So it's a balancing act. We recently just hired an equitable energy advisor. They'll be coming online in the next 2 to 3 weeks, I think, and it's really going to step our game up further. And then we're also looking at like pilot projects to show success and show how this shouldn't be an either or. So 2 examples there. One, we've been working through a large scale acquisition in Virginia and the Appalachians called our Cumberland Forest Project. When we bought this huge acreage of land, there was already abandoned mine lands on it. So we thought, well, let's kind of put our money where our mouth is to a certain degree and try to bring some solar in here and layer other economic benefits in. When we brought in bids to bid on kind of building that solar project, and it's not a huge project, but it's not a small one. If a developer wasn't willing to commit $1 million to local community benefits that run through this project, they didn't have a chance to bid on the project. So we sort of set standards and seeing how that works, and then seeing how to make sure that those funds are being distributed elsewhere. We're not the only group doing that. Microsoft and Sol Systems have a really cool partnership going on right now. I'd recommend looking into to think about how does like equity and finance drive into those communities. And then the last thing we're trying to do is use our nonprofit status to uniquely access IRA dollars to try to get these community centers and areas that are priorities of community the energy that they could need at zero to low cost. So one example of how we're doing that in Des Moines, Iowa, we've been working with an unhoused population center to kind of bring our relationships and values to the table to help them install energy system that takes them totally off the grid, no cost to them, through kind of different public finance mechanisms. And so that way they can take those dollars that were being spent for their energy bills and instead drive that back into the community. So these are just like some examples. There's no one size fits all, I think, from our perspective, but we're trying to get a lot of flowers to bloom here and then see which one we can replicate.
Thanks. Does anyone else have other thoughts on this? I think this will keep this one going. This is the last question we'll have today.
Yeah, Nathan, I just wanted also to flag, because I always, so the just completely escaped me, the Power of Place West. Maybe you could talk about that in the Tribal Voices appendix that you wrote as well.
Great, thanks for that prompt, Megan. So one of the things that I didn't have time to talk about here, but is like another strategy TNC is working on, is basically a complementary version to that Princeton net zero report that Megan went through, kind of looking at how do we deeply decarbonize? What does that look like? What are the land use implications? But how do we do it if we add some other protections and values to it? So what happens if we add all of site renewables right to it in our region? Can we still meet the goals? And then also, what if we add other factors, such as working lands factors, such as, again, energy communities as defined by the IRA. So we've been looking through some of that data, and that's going to be, we released the first version, which is in the focus on the Western United States just a couple months ago. We're going to be releasing our national product in May. When we were working in the West, obviously a lot of the West is through tribal sovereignty, tribal lands. And so we want to be really careful that we were providing a roadmap and a vision, but not suggesting we are telling these communities where they can and can't go. And so we did a series of listening sessions with different tribal partners in the Western United States to just understand their perspectives on renewable energy. It's not saying one thing's good or bad, and it's not getting to like, scientific data here. It's just kind of understanding how are those viewpoints. And we made that report publicly available that I think, especially for folks that work with indigenous communities and in the Western United States, you all might find useful. And we'll be sure to share that either in the Zoom or email afterwards.
Thanks, Nathan. So we're about to bump up against 3:30. I think, Mark, do you want to close this out?
Will, thank you, everyone. Great participation. I know almost everybody hung in to the very end, and I feel like this conversation could go on for even longer. So just know that you've got a resource, and these folks that were presenters today, and certainly in Megan, if there's tools that we need to develop or additional data, just let us know, because we're willing to, try to put our heads together and help all of you, because it's it's a challenge. It's one of those, we need renewable energy. Nobody will question that. We've got to tackle climate adaptation, but let's do it in the most thoughtful, scientific way to help avoid impacts of the species of greatest conservation needs. So again, thanks everybody, really appreciate it, and we'll hope to see you in the next learning series in about a month.
Thanks
Bye.
all.
Yeah, thanks for all the great feedback.
Man, this was an active session. So Ryan, Megan, Mark, I forget the other speakers. I'm terrible with names. I did take notes. I will get these out to you probably tomorrow sometime. I'm Chris, I'm sorry. If you could take a look and just let me know. And Ryan, if you're still here. I'll get these out to you. Take a look. Let me know if you have any comments or questions, and or feedback rather. And then Mark can get them out to all the people who participated today.
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Is there a copy of the chat comments?
I've got one.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
and what I've done is I think I was able to copy them all into the notes in sort of a rough order that I think that they fit. So you'll have that too.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for having me.
Thanks,
All right,
Ryan.
I'm gonna go join my next meeting. Thanks all.
Same
Take
here.
care.
Thanks, Ryan.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Hey, Megan. Oh, you're gone.
Oh, and you're also still recording too, Mark, so stop that.